Welcome again, everyone. My name is Diana Sinton. I'm the Executive Director of UCGIS, and I'm very happy to be able to have a speaker right now. I can introduce Dr. Joshua Lieberman. He is the Director of OGC's Innovation Program with OGC's Innovation Program. And OGC, for those who are not familiar with that acronym, is the Open Geospatial Consortium, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that. He may have only been at OGC for a relatively brief amount of time, but he's been working with data and with geospatial data for many decades, including with organizations and companies such as Tumbling Walls and Deloitte. He's not an active user of social media, such as Twitter, but I appreciate his having opted to describe his Twitter location as being on or about the geoid. So that's where he'll be speaking to us from today. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Lieberman. Just as another reminder, your microphones are going to remain muted throughout here, and just type questions into the question space and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Thanks, everyone. And make a presenter.
Okay, hopefully this works. That looks familiar. It's something that I put together before. So thank you, Diana, and thank you to UCGIS for providing me the opportunity to talk about the relationship of GIS to some interesting topics, you know, mundane everyday things such as knowledge, democratic society, the connected world, and a few other things. So this talk will be a bit rambling, which is a good thing to do when talking about space, but I want to touch on both aspects of what OGC does, aspects of what we as geographic information scientists and related do, and how that might actually have a bearing on the commonality that we all agree that that's some basis for the way that democratic societies work, and we agree that in many ways the information world can be a threat as well as a boon to that. But I think, at least myself, I'm really not sure how exactly that works. You know, do we have to share everything? Do we have to share something? What is it and how is it that we have to share in order to have something like a functioning democracy and a civil society? So let's see if there's a connection. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll dredge up some ideas from all of these spheres and see how well they might fit together. And we'll go from there. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end to talk about this. Consider that shared knowledge in a democratic society and connected world has a question mark at the end of it. And well, we might deal with that question at the end of the talk. So as Diana mentioned, I'm presently working for and representing the Open Geospatial Consortium. And one of the connections here is that it's about geospatial information, and particularly it's about sharing that geospatial information, how to do it, when to do it, and how to be effective in doing so. And adopting particularly the FAIR principles, making that information findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So where does that bring us to? Okay, so first I'd like to introduce you all a bit to the Open Geospatial Consortium, what it is particularly today, and to me, and about what it means to develop and agree and use a standard. That's really all about agreement. And so there is this connection of what do we agree on and how have we agreed to it and what for, that relates to non-geospatial information questions as well. I'd like then to sort of touch on each of these pieces of that sentence or question that I put in. What is shared knowledge? What is shared versus sharing? Do we need more or less shared knowledge? Well, it sounds like we should always have more, but in some ways that is a problem. And how does that relate to common ground in democratic societies? One of the questions is, how little common ground do we actually need for a democratic society to work? And then how does this relate to the connected world? Uh, we know that there are many ways in which the information that passes around our world connected by the internet uh, is helpful in understanding more and also helpful in understanding less. And maybe there's something in the foundations of how that was created that is the problem. I'll turn to some aspects of geographic information science. I think there's great potential, untapped potential to help the situation, but first we need to get around some of the um, traps and abysses lying about the mapping world to do so. And then finally, I hope we can put this together into some, at least, set of ideas or principles for building better citizens who are then better able to take part in a democratic society. So first of all, what is OGC? So OGC is a global consortium, non-governmental organization, and it represents over 500 industry, government, research, and academic member organizations, including among organizations that it has a relationship with, UCGIS and many others. And it serves as a developer, an STO, a developer of standards that are global consensus standards for the representation and exchange of geographic information. But in order to do that, it serves as much more. So one of the functions that it fulfills is to be a hub for thought leadership and innovation, because the standards need to work in the future and not just in the past. And it also is a neutral and trusted forum because it's important, as we'll further see, to be able to talk both within communities and across communities about how they work and need to share such information, and have their organizations, their people, their systems be able to interoperate on the basis of those information flows. So having a trusted forum so that we can find true and not enforced consensus is really critical to actually have something that works. And then that all leads into the ability to develop open standards that represent cutting edge technology and are a consensus on the way to use information in the systems of today and tomorrow. So the members are interestingly about evenly divided between the commercial sphere, including many companies that you know, such as the SRI and Oracle and Microsoft and Apple and so on and so on. Government, many agencies and both state, national, and international level, and research and academia. Those are traditional universities and colleges, as well as many research institutes and other organizations that provide that input of the future. What will geographic information look like so we can find the value in being able to exchange it? So let me turn from OGC to who I am. As I noted and Diana noted, I'm a director of OGC's innovation programs, and what that is, I'll get to in a moment. I refer to it as our what if program. And I also have a side gig. I'm associated with the Harvard Center for Geographic Analysis. And that's a really interesting organization. It's a part of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard. And it really serves as the gathering point for GIS in the Harvard community. So it provides education and training and consultation for many, many groups and individuals who want to make use of geographic analysis and mapping, and serves as that forum for connection among different communities. In fact, the new director of the Center for Geographic Analysis, or CGA, is actually a professor in the Harvard School of Public Health, who is particularly interested in the way that geographic analysis can enrich the study of population health in particular, and enable insights and effectiveness that this geographic geospatial perspective would otherwise not be able to achieve. And the interesting thing is that although GIS analysts and personnel have worked on health issues for a long time, and public health workers have used maps for a long time, there has also been a kind of a divide, I think, less of a shared understanding of each other's expertise. And so one of the roles of CGA is to support those conversations that allow people to share that expertise and experience and trust that they can work together based on it. And that kind of model is something that I'll be talking about further. Myself, I was actually trained as an earth scientist, a geologist, a quantitative metamorphic petrologist, actually. But one of the things that I took most out of that training was a, let's say, a perspective on reality, because in geology there is so much of reality that you cannot experience, that you cannot develop evidence for. You know, the 4.6 billion years that we don't have the direct experience of. And so one of the things that you learn as an earth scientist is how to tell geology stories. One of my favorites was an assignment where we were supposed to draw a cross section, right, of the Earth's crust from the eastern US to the mid-Atlantic ridge. And I said, well, so what are we supposed to work with? And I was given 4 boreholes at various places along that. And I said, well, this is not enough information to decide what the story of that cross section is. And the answer was, no, you don't infer from those. What you do is come up with a story of that cross section that does not contradict the boreholes. So a lot of geology is telling a good story of the Earth that is consistent with the evidence and that's available, and points to what evidence would be more useful to use. And the interesting thing is that we use many models in geology, but very often we don't have what we're accustomed to with models, which is the ability to predict the future, because that's a long ways away. So one of the reasons that I went more into water resources science and then became involved much more in GIS and internet GIS startups, and finally in the technical diplomacy of geographic information standard development, is the interest to see the experience that the knowledge of the Earth that I can acquire allows me to test. So that some people are much better at I am in saying, and this may be true in the future as it was in the past, but I've increasingly moved towards working with what I can see on a map and being able to test what I can see on the map against what is happening in a more of a human timescale. So that's who I am. I've been involved in many aspects of geographic information, from geology, geologic mapping, to water resources modeling, and to making maps and geographic analysis available on the internet for many different user groups and markets and communities. And then finally asking, well, what if it was easier to share that information not only within a particular community, such as the hydrology community, but to people who don't know those specific contexts and concepts and representations? How would we talk to them as well? Which leads into such things as geosemantics and really many aspects, I think, at the frontier of geographic information science. So let's see where that's led us. So as I mentioned, the innovation program is what we call the What If program. And that really comes about because, in the early years of OGC, what we did a lot was to develop the framework, the conceptual framework that everybody could agree to based on how they practice GIS. And at that time, GIS practice was largely, mainframes and workstations and standalone organizations and data sets. And so we started considering, well, okay, maybe we have this framework so that we can construct data sets and interfaces that allow groups to exchange that information to work in a more distributed fashion. But without those standards, we don't know how that would work. So the What If program came about to say, what if we had GML? What if we had web mapping service? What could we do with that we couldn't do without it? And we don't have, industry practice to guide us because we don't have the standard to guide industry practice. So sort of cutting that knot of which comes first, the practice or the innovation, is the core of that innovation program activity. That we have requirements and ideas, we look at where ecosystems and agreements could change things, and we have the communication to see where that would be of value and where the ideas and the practices are that would bring those together. And that then involves discourse, not only in the sense of do we agree on what's in the world, but do we agree what's important? And that happens in the domain working groups and standards working groups about all sorts of different communities and also applications of that sharing of information, sharing so that it works for the person or system that shares the information and the one that receives it back. So standards, innovation, communications, and really it's about communities and their interchange, their sharing within and between the communities. So standards are important, but what are they? And some folks from NIST, from the National Institutes of Standards, really kind of straightened me out on this. They had a great workshop on the role of standards as agreements. So whenever we work together, our systems work together, even the parts of our programs work together, they need to agree on how information flows from one to the other to enable these pieces to connect. And if we had to do that, agree on how that would work and how to anticipate and work with the information coming across that connection every time, we'd never get anything done. So standards are really those agreements, but they're ones that have proven to be effective, and they've proven to be durable, so reusable. But one of the things that requires is not just a specification, these 2 bits go here, those 2 bits go there, but they also need to be based on a shared knowledge of understanding of what that information represents and how it can be used, what's a valid application of it. So when, as you said, you put revision clouds on your drawings and you don't have a shared knowledge of what those represent, you can come up with some interesting results and applying them back to the real world. So let's turn to that question of sharing and shared knowledge, and maybe we can deconstruct that a little bit. So we're all, I think, probably pretty familiar with this sense that knowledge is a bit of a pyramid. We have these different ways of representing our interaction, our experience of the world, and we have different sort of levels of uh, ability to work with that information. So we have a data level. I would call that kind of the signal, and then we parse and structure that to form information. And at that point, we're really kind of separating the information as this independent entity that is telling us something about the data that it came from, but can take on many different forms and locations. That sort of independence of information from physical artifacts is one of the interesting revolutions of the past few hundred years, where we said, well, it's not just the coin, it's the idea of money. Still wrapping our heads around that, I think. And then there's this step of information going into knowledge. And in some way that's better used and better trusted. And I would argue that one of the ways in which that's the case is that it's information that you've worked with, so that you've had experience using information to make predictions, to have expectations, and you've kind of run that back against reality in some way to give you some trust of the value of that knowledge. And so that difference between information and knowledge really is having some proof that you can trust it. And there's, of course, on the World Wide Web side, some various constructions. This is from W3C of those levels of what we know based on some of the standards that are used to represent it. XML as data level, RDF is in terms of structuring and using known concepts, applying rules and logic and proof to achieve knowledge, so trusted knowledge. So knowledge that has an expected value in terms of helping us to deal with the world. Now, that is kind of a hard won bit of trust. And it's interesting that the W3C also puts on the side this idea of signature and signing and authority for that information. And there's another way of looking at, which is that in some sense you can go through these steps of developing your own knowledge, or you can take somebody's signature, their authority, to trust knowledge that has been shared with you. So turning to the idea of sharing, we have this idea that we need shared knowledge in order to work together. The basis for example, being able to share information, because that information is connected to knowledge that we both have. We both know what a polygon is, know how to work with it, what it can represent, and so on. But there is another way that that terminology is actually used. So It's used in terms of shared versus personal knowledge. So if you share knowledge with somebody, that the act of sharing, then you're providing them knowledge that they have not developed themselves, as opposed to personal knowledge, which is knowledge that has come from following this this sequence and journey of going from data through information to knowledge that you can trust. And so when we think of shared knowledge, we often think of, well, we want to establish that we have personal knowledge which is comparable between the two. But the only way we can do that is to actually undergo the same experiences, develop the same personal knowledge, or have some way of testing that our personal knowledge is also shared knowledge, or that the knowledge that's been shared with it is consistent with what we would have developed personally. So there is that problem that shared knowledge is not necessarily knowledge you should trust. You know, and you may be trusting it according to an authority which is itself not trustworthy. This is something we've been running into a lot. So another way to look at sharing is that shared knowledge is often understood as one of the ways that a community is organized, is defined, is it's the people who have shared knowledge, or it's people who accept the knowledge that's been shared to them on the basis of that community. The problem is that then the other part of defining the community is exclusion. So either that knowledge is not shared with people outside the community, or it's not trusted, and that's okay. It helps to be a member of the community that people outside the community do not have or accept that knowledge which is shared within the community. So too much or not enough. The sharing increases the scope of ability to exchange, but it decreases the sense of community within which that forms the basis for exchange. So this community and sharing is definitely at least a double-edged sword, if not more. So we're really talking about shared knowledge, the process of sharing, and what we are sharing to work towards having something that's shared. Is it shared on authority? Is it shared on shared experience? Is it shared on trust that's been developed in another way? So a complicated subject, but not straightforward. So what does this have to do with what we might term common ground in democratic societies? And I will try to use geographic metaphors as much as possible. Whether they help or not remains to be seen as we go along. So the question of democracy, we're having a voice, and we need to have a voice on the same thing in order to decide what the aggregate in some fashion, whether it's a majority or consensus, what that aggregate is. And there are terms that we use such as common ground and level playing fields. One of the questions is, do we really need a coherent sense of commonality, or is it really the truth to the phrase that we all use, that, you know, democracy is the worst of all possible systems except for any other? Maybe it's literally the chaos which protects us from some tyrannies of greater rationality. But there is some connection between geography and democracy. So geography is not destiny with democracy, unless that's the only basis for having a voices to put together. Democracy is not geographic unless the only way we can understand those voices speaking on the same subject is if they're connected to the same neighborhood or the same region or the same national extent. So what it does tell us is that there is locality involved. If we want to have voices which are speaking about something, then it needs to be speaking about some shared experience from which we can share knowledge that's personal. And what we do know is that those are often arranged in circles. There's a pretty common concept of circles of trust, and that is connected in many ways to circles of geography, uh, where so those localities where we can have the common experience and interaction with what knowledge appears to be telling us that we can then share. So there is this connection between geography and democracy, and it also, I think, tells us that without geography, there is something that may be missing in democracy, a difficulty in seeing whether the voices have a common basis and whether they can be brought together to define what the voice of a people in aggregate can be. And this, interestingly, then kind of connects to many issues that we're familiar with in GI science with aggregates, with areas, with regions and the choice of them. So we have, these aspects of what do we need to agree on and what do we have to hold in common. And so let's continue along and see where these may play out. So the connected world. So the connected world, we're talking about the internet and the web and applications such as social media that run on top of them, have many amazing opportunities for communication, but I think a lot of ambiguity about what they are communicating. So, and in the work on geospatial semantics, we've really seen this because we have this form of organizing and representing knowledge, which is the graph. And so we can use that construction for many things, including the World Wide Web, the graph of web pages, or the graph of URIs. And the problem is that we can use that for many different forms. In many ways, this happened back at the dawn of the web when people said, okay, so we have all this information. How does it relate to reality? And this is represented in, for example, ways of encoding graphs where we have logical assertions, this is of this type, is a. We have spatial assertions, this is, overlaps that other thing in reality. And we have the, the predominant sense of the web, which is see this also and make up your own mind how it relates. And then having these connections in a graph that are not really characterized, what is this relationship and what I can do with that, then we have difficulties of understanding. So what does it mean to have a graph which is the web? So we have people with organizations with kind of their own interests that are saying, well, this is what those links mean. This is why you should value the number of links back to this page for the purposes of judging it. But of course, we know that search engine optimization, graph metrics, and ranking are performed for many other reasons than should you believe this? Does this tell us something about the real world? Does it connect with other information that might be about that same part of the real world? So what this has to do with either truth or geography is very suspect. And remembering that's the case is also very difficult to do. So what's in a graph, and particularly, is the evidence of analyzing that graph giving you weight of evidence against the world? And this is where social media has this great problem, that if we look at the way that geography gives us a means of a weight of evidence, saying, okay, about this locality, about this feature, we can judge what we know about it, the truth and the agreement on that, based on many different kinds of evidence that can be combined on the basis of location. Then we have the piling up of evidence with no sense that that brings us to a greater accuracy about what it tells us. In fact, it can be literally a sewer. You know, you only get out of it what you put into it. Or in statistical terms, bias in and bias out as you pile it higher and deeper. So if you have a means of exchanging stuff that leads to not the piling up of evidence, but the duplication of evidence, then if you're not aware of that, then you have a system of knowledge which is systematically false and misleading. And remembering that when it's so compelling is very difficult. So that difficulty of how does this tell us about the real world is ingrained right in the web itself. If you may have ever come across the discussions around HTTP range 14, a very energetic discussion in the early 2000s, how can we reference what the web is about in the real world when we're on the web? And that presents a fascinating discussion. It was resolved by saying, well, you can't dereference, you know, to a parking lot, but you can redirect the reference to the parking lot to information about it. That is 303. We've redirecting. See also. The problem is that that doesn't tell you what that tells you about the information. It just says, judge for yourself whether this has any relation to reality that we have this link for, we have this identifier for. And this is carried on through the RDF and OWL world. You're familiar with, you can make a concept that is in the real world. You can make a concept which is in the information world. But if you connect those together with a predicate, to say an assertion, you know, this is represents that, then you can't refer to that assertion. And if two people make different assertions, unless you perform a awkward and not very well used and difficult to process action known as reification. So the basis of the semantic web also makes it difficult to really look at the web as evidence for the real world and vice versa. So there's actually some work on linked spatial data where this problem has come to a head. You know, we really need to show with spatial data, what is this telling us about the world? What is knowledge links? What is representation links? What is actual assertions of spatial relationships? And some initiatives in Open Geospatial Consortium, ELFI and SELFI, the environmental linked feature interoperability experiments, have tried to look at this. How do we be more explicit about saying that we have some feature in the world, and what we talk about that feature on the internet and on the web has a defined relationship. And we can also gather all the different evidence so we can really say, you know, is that really the same evidence, or is that different evidence that provides us a great sense of trust. So I'm going to go quickly through this, but just to say that there is also in the geospatial information world a standardization of an agreed way of understanding how we get from the world, reality, through discourse and through observation and sensing to the representation and information. Of course, most of the time people skip this, put that resulting information on the web or elsewhere, and then we lose that connection that says, what sort of evidence is this? And how can I use it as knowledge? Meaning, how can I act on that information and expect and interact with the world on the basis of it? So this is there, if only it were used. So turning a little bit to GI science, this is a familiar topic, and for GI science, this is all very familiar, and we agree on this among ourselves and say we, need to be careful for this. But always this remains a challenge in providing value to the wider world and helping people not to make the same mistakes when we provide them the benefits of GIS, of geographic information, to help them. One of my favorites in terms of the map is not the terrain is, of course, this famous New Yorker cover of the New Yorker's view of the US, which is not how you would do this in geographic coordinates. But it gives us some sense of the cognition of space that we have to deal with. And we turn to an election map and we have a map which deals with space and is trying to send a message about what people are doing. And it's very hard to look at that map and say, oh yeah, that represents a landslide for blue. Interestingly, there are subsets where the spatial visual message and the numerical message are more closely aligned, but that doesn't change the both visual pitfalls and the visual persuasion that can take advantage of that. That has to do with both that, spatial thinking. How do we think about space, and does that relate to a coordinate perspective? And the ways that, that categorical visualization, and here's some more cases of that, can be misleading and can be used, in fact, to mislead. So this extends to the, aerial unit problems, the aggregate nonsense. We can derive what isn't true from the proper aggregates, whether we're providing perspective or stealing an election, and then going back down to a finer level from the greater level, many ways that we can be misled intentionally or unintentionally. And then there's this problem when we're looking at space and looking at vision that we're incredibly good, for better or worse, at finding patterns. Teaching geographic analysis, spatial analysis, one of the interesting points is where you show patterns, and people will say, oh yeah, that pattern on the left, that's definitely random, and the pattern on the right, there's a pattern there. That's not a random distribution. Well, in fact, the distribution on the left is a randomized uniform distribution. On the one on the right is more in line with a random process. So we're very, very able to see patterns, and unless they're helped by some understanding of random processes, it's amazing what people can find in the visual sphere based on but not reflecting geography. So turning finally to how do we turn this back? This is a couple of thoughts, and then I hope we can turn to some discussion. where the ways that we can connect understanding the pitfalls, information to the real world, to space and to time and to geography, I think have good lessons for how we can help people to be better citizens by deciding what they've shared on the basis of authority, what they've shared on the basis of experience, and how discourse and lines of evidence really can support rather than hindering that. So I think one of the conclusions I have from this is that geography and space matter to the sorts of shared knowledge that has authentic trust rather than authorized trust, or community that trust that comes out of needing to, wanting to, or being uh, required to belong to a community. And the layered paradigm actually still works for this, saying, okay, here are these many different layers of disparate information and evidence, and overlaying them tells us something about which ones are true, which ones are false, and what that nature of reality at that location is. The linking paradigm works even better if we know how to process, work with those links and understand what those links mean and why they were created. There's an interesting project in the W3C and OGC map markup language, and this leads eventually, we hope, to being able to essentially drag and drop that evidence, those links, into that map view that gives us a compelling and somewhat neutral view of what does the web really know about this location that we can apply our powers of spatial inference to judge and make use of. And then one of the other conclusions that for me is that we really want to share not just the map, but that process of mapping, the process of representing, comparing, and analyzing evidence based on the fact that space is whole. We're just trying to understand that. So finally, and this is maybe what we can have as the basis for some questions and discussions, geography can really serve as a mechanism for trust in the weight of evidence. It provides that grounding both in how it is able to integrate information and provide a means of discourse that lets us share it, not just share packaged knowledge, but actually share how we came to trust that knowledge. It's obvious, but yes, people lie on the web. They put information on the web and process it and package it and provide it for reasons that don't have to do with what other people might try to learn from it. Really, that's observe it and don't absorb it. And in talking about this issue of trust, we want to have trust in the sorts of shared knowledge that justify that trust. And that has to do with the sharing, the synchronization of personal knowledge rather than the sharing of authorized knowledge. But really, this needs to be based on norms, on normalization. And so we can say we want to have agreement locally where interests are common, but based on a way of going about that which is more global, to agree on that process, if even the outcome varies according to the circles that it's being conducted in. And then, so coming back around, that leads me to the question, do we need shared knowledge? What role does it play in a democratic society? And can a connected world advance that, or can it only get in the way of that real connection? I don't really yet know the answer to that, but I hope I've put out some ideas and tools that have connection to standards and have a connection to geographic information and can be used to find a way to answer it. So with that, I'll leave off and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for those. Thank you for those thoughts. Let's, if you want to leave up that last imagery or the last OGC slide there, that's a lovely one with pictures. If anyone has there, we have a few minutes left. Let's please feel free to put a question into the chat space, into the question space, and we'll see if we can get Dr. Lieberman to respond to these. Oh, good, we've got some contact info there. We have a question that's come in requesting a little bit more comments, perhaps about the weight of evidence, a phrase you had used earlier.
Yeah, so that's a good question. There is, always a question whether what we observe from one observation or from one sensor or from one experience represents the reality in terms of can we use that information to interact with the real world. And there is a lot about, well, is there really a real world? And I'm reminded of some remarks that Robert Reich made about, and I won't pick on a particular state, but let's say a state where the education board wanted to enforce an understanding of evolution that it could be right as true as anything else. But the problem is, he said, was that so it's going to be difficult for people educated that way to get a job because the knowledge is not only, is there some abstract sense of could it be true or not, but does it work? Does this information about reality actually help you to engage with reality? And so multiple interactions with reality added together are more likely to give you that value in further interactions than just one alone, representing a single point in time and space, or maybe not. Maybe it's completely made up. So that weight of different approaches is really how we judge accuracy. From lots of repetitions, we can get precision, but for accuracy about the real world, it's the multiple lines of evidence, and that's what we use the term weight of evidence for. If we redo the same thing over and over again, and we have no idea whether they're distinguished by noise or by bias, then that's not a true weight. So I think the weight of evidence also encompasses the idea of diverse lines of evidence. And how can we tell that something is diverse and yet is evidence about the same thing? And that's really where geography comes in.
Interesting. I want to have a comment. I want to shift to a different question that's come in now about some connections between the work here that you've accumulated over all of the years of experiences that you have as a scientist in these different areas with different perspectives on data. How is this influencing specifically the activities that you're going to be doing right now with OGC?
That's a good question. So OGC does try to, so let me take this back a little bit. So OGC has a challenge of its success. Let me put it that way. So in early days, there was a semantics group as part of the development of the OGC abstract specifications that are shared with ISO. that define such things as, how do we figure out what's a feature, and how do we represent it and tie it to the mass of the Earth through coordinate reference systems and geometry. And we set the sites, it set the sites low to say, okay, communities have shared concepts, and as long as we can encode those concepts, we can allow communities to share information. And that was wildly successful. In fact, there is information being shared worldwide and now across communities, not just within one community, which means now we have to figure out, how do we make one community's information work for another community? And so the problem of having one community's evidence work for another and be accessible to another has led us to the World Wide Web. So now physically people can use OGC APIs, for example, to get information anywhere in the world about anywhere in the world, to get massive amounts of data and process it. But it hasn't really helped us to understand how one bit of information relates to another that does have the concepts we understand. So we're increasingly going in the direction of understanding how to agree on linking spatial data together. And as I tried to show, you can do linking well, and you can do it incredibly badly, and you can do it dangerously. So I think with the standing up of a new Geosparkle, for example, standards group to deal with, graphs and webs and ontologies and how they really work together so that everybody in different communities can achieve weights of evidence and insights. I think this is a primary challenge that OGC will be addressing in the next few years.
So those are some of the technologies that you think are going to be good going forward, giving us hope for semantic web and linked data.
Yeah, I think that we have some of the mechanisms, not all of them, and we have some of the agreements, but not all of them. And so we need both of them. We need the mechanisms, such as how do we say this information is about that piece of ground based on this evidence, and how do we have agreement among people on how to use it? That's the crux of the problem, I think, both for working with spatial data and benefiting from it. We hope in a wider variety of ways than ever.
Great. All right. Thank you very much for those comments and ideas. Thank you, audience, for the questions and for your attention. We're very happy to have been able to share this with the audience now. It's been recorded, and we will be sharing a link with people that you are also free to distribute further. So Dr. Lieberman, thank you very much for spending time with us now on International GIS Day.
I welcome you and all the attendees for sharing their time with me as well. I'm honored.
All right, take care, everyone. This concludes the final webinar in our fall semester of the 2021 series. Stay tuned for more webinars coming forward in January, February, and March to be announced. Thanks, everyone, very much.
Stay
Bye-bye.
safe, stay well, and keep questioning.
Right.